Shalom, little one, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's start a new book of the Torah, Exodus. Remember, Joseph had saved Mitzrayim from famine. He had been a ruler, second only to Pharaoh, and because of him, the children of Yisrael were welcomed into the land of Goshen. There, they lived in peace, raising their families and teaching their children about the Elohim of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They worked the land, cared for their flocks, and filled their homes with laughter and songs of praise. The warm fields of Goshen were filled with children playing in the soft grass, their voices ringing with joy. Fathers worked alongside their sons, guiding their hands as they tended the sheep. Mothers sang lullabies to their babies, whispering stories of Yahuah's faithfulness in the quiet of the evening. But time passed, and Yosef, the great protector of his people, grew old. His brothers, too, lived their years and were gathered to their fathers. The generation that had once been welcomed into Mitzrayim was no more, and a new Pharaoh arose, a ruler who did not remember Joseph, nor the kindness he had once shown to Egypt. At first, the people of Yisrael were left to live as they always had. But Pharaoh watched them. He saw their numbers growing, their families becoming stronger. He saw them filling the land of Goshen with their children, their flocks, and their faith in Elohim. His heart grew cold with fear. If war comes, he said to his advisors, they may join our enemies and fight against us. They are too many. They are too strong. The advisors murmured in agreement, nodding their heads. We must weaken them before they rise against us, one of them said. Pharaoh thought long and hard, his fingers drumming against the gold armrests of his throne. And then a wicked idea took root in his mind. We will make them our slaves. That very day, his soldiers rode into Goshen on swift horses, their chariots cut in deep into the dirt roads. They carried whips and heavy chains, and with harsher voices, they shouted orders to the people of Yisrael. You will build our cities, they commanded. You will work the land for Pharaoh. The men of Israel, who had once worked freely in their fields, were forced into back-breaking labor. They carried bricks under the blazing sun, their skin burning, their backs aching. They dug trenches and built great cities, stone upon stone, for a Pharaoh who did not care for them. The taskmasters walked among them, cracking their whips in warning. But even in their suffering, the people of Israel did not break. Their families still gathered in the evenings, whispering words of hope. They still told their children of Yahuah's promises, of the land he had sworn to give them. And still, they continued to multiply. Pharaoh watched in frustration as their numbers continued to grow. His plan had failed. Even under the weight of oppression, the children of Israel became stronger. His fear deepened, twisting into something even darker, something cruel. If labor cannot break them, Pharaoh muttered, we will strike at their future. He summoned the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and gave them a terrible command. When you deliver a Hebrew baby, if it is a son, you must kill him. If it is a daughter, she may live. The midwives trembled before Pharaoh's decree, but in their hearts, they feared Elohim more than they feared the king of Mitzrayim. They could not do as he asked. When Hebrew mothers gave birth, the midwives let their baby boys live, their tiny hands curling around their mother's fingers, their cries filling the air. Pharaoh soon heard of their disobedience, and his fury burned like the desert sun. He called for Shiphrah and Puah and demanded, why have you disobeyed me? The midwives bowed before him, their faces calm, though their hearts pounded within their chests. The Hebrew women are strong, they said. They give birth before we can even arrive. Pharaoh's anger rolled through the palace like a storm, shaking the pillars of his throne room. If the midwives would not obey, then all of Mitzrayim would take part in his plan. He sent forth a decree, carried by the mouths of his soldiers, spreading through the land like fire. Every Hebrew son that is born, they shouted, must be thrown into the the Nile River. Terror swept through the homes of Yisrael. Mothers clutched their newborn sons, rocking them in the darkness, whispering prayers to Elohim. Fathers built hidden places, trying desperately to keep their children safe. But Pharaoh's soldiers were many and their ears were sharp. The cries of Yisrael filled the night, sorrow carried upon the wind. But Yahuah had not forgotten his people. Even in the midst of their pain, he was weaving a plan, one that would raise up a deliverer. The cries of Yisrael filled the night. Mothers clutched their babies close, whispering prayers to Yahuah, hiding their newborn sons from Pharaoh's soldiers. Fathers built secret places in their homes, covering their children in the darkness, praying the soldiers would pass by. But the order had gone out, spreading through every corner of Mitzrayim. Every Hebrew son that is born must be thrown into the Nile River. The soldiers patrolled the streets, their torches flickering in the night. They knocked on doors, stepping into homes uninvited, searching for the cries of an infant. Fear gripped the hearts of Israel. Each day, they wondered if it would be the day their child was taken. But in the midst of this fear, in a quiet home among the Hebrews, a child was born. He was a beautiful baby boy, his eyes bright, his cries strong. His mother, a woman from the tribe of Levi, held him close, pressing his tiny body against her chest. She looked into his face and knew she could not give him up. For 3 months, she hid him. She rocked him gently, shushing his cries before they could be heard. She wrapped him in soft cloths and sang to him in whispers. She kept him close, breathing in his warmth, knowing every moment with him was a gift. But as the weeks passed, he grew. His voice became louder, his movements stronger. She knew she could not keep him hidden forever. One night, as the stars glowed over Goshen, she sat in silence, watching her baby sleep. Tears filled her eyes as she ran her fingers over his soft cheek. She could not protect him in her home, but perhaps Yahuah would protect him elsewhere. She rose early the next morning and took a basket woven from reeds. She coated it with tar and pitch, making sure it was strong and would not sink in the water. Then she laid her son inside, wrapping him in warm cloths, tucking him in as if he were going to sleep. Her hands trembled as she carried the basket to the river. The Yahuah stretched wide before her, its waters slow and steady. She knelt at the edge, her breath shaky. His sister Miriam stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. She had been told to stay and watch, to see what would happen. With a whispered prayer, the mother placed the basket into the water. The current took hold, carrying it gently among the reeds. She did not want to let go. Her fingers clung to the edge, just for a moment longer. But then she released it and the basket floated away. Miriam followed at a distance, her small feet stepping carefully along the banks of the river. She watched as the basket bobbed on the surface, hidden among the tall reeds that lined the shore. The river carried it forwards, toward the palace. Near the water, a woman stood with her servants. She was dressed in fine linen, gold bracelets shining on her arms. It was Pharaoh's daughter. She had come to bathe in the river, enjoying the coolness of the water beneath the blazing sun. But as she stepped into the shallows, something caught her eye. A basket nestled among the reeds. She frowned, curiosity pulling at her heart. She called to her servant, "Bring that to me." The woman waded through the water, lifting the basket into her arms and carrying it to her mistress. Pharaoh's daughter took hold of the woven reeds, unfastened the cloth, and pulled back the covers. Inside, the baby stirred. Then his eyes fluttered open, and he cried, a cry of hunger, of longing, of needing his mother's warmth. Pharaoh's daughter gasped softly, her heart moved with compassion. She reached into the basket and lifted the baby into her arms, cradling him gently. "This is one of the Hebrew children," she murmured. Miriam, who had been watching from a distance, took a deep breath. She could not wait any longer. She hurried forward, stepping out of the reeds and approaching the princess. "Shall I find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" she asked. Pharaoh's daughter looked down at the little girl, then back at the baby in her arms. "Yes," she said softly. "Go." Miriam turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she rushed home. She burst through the door, breathless, and called to her mother, "Come quickly!" Together, they returned to the river, where Pharaoh's daughter waited with the child. The princess looked at the woman and placed the baby into her arms. "Take this child and nurse him for me," she said, "and I will give you wages." The mother's heart swelled. She held her son tightly, pressing her face against his, breathing in his warmth once more. Yahuah had done what seemed impossible. Her son had been saved, and for a little while longer he would remain in her arms. She took him home, and for the next few years she cared for him, watching him grow strong and healthy. But she knew it could not last forever. When he was older, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, just as she had promised. The princess took the child's hand and smiled. She named him Mosheh, Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Though he was raised in Pharaoh's palace, though he was clothed in fine linen and called the grandson of the king, Moshe had fled from Mitzrayim. Once he had walked the grand halls of Pharaoh's palace, clothed in fine linen, called the grandson of a king. But that life was gone. Now he walked among the mountains of Midian, the hot desert wind tugging at his robes. For 40 years he had lived far from Mitzrayim, tending sheep in the quiet wilderness. He had married Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest, and had become a shepherd, leading his flock across the rugged land. His hands, once soft from palace life, were now rough and calloused. His feet, once stepping across polished stone, were now covered in desert dust. He no longer heard the cries of his people, but Yahuah had not forgotten them, and soon Moshe's life would change forever. It was a day like any other. Moshe led his flock through the wilderness, guiding them toward fresh pasture. He climbed the rocky slopes, stepping carefully as the sheep followed behind him. The sun was high, beating down upon the land, and in the distance, a mountain stood tall against the sky. It was called Har Chorev, the mountain of Elohim. As Moshe drew near, something caught his eye, a fire, a bush burning in the distance. Its flames licked the sky, bright and wild, yet something was strange. Moshe furrowed his brow, stepping closer. The flames danced and crackled, but the bush did not turn to ash. It was burning, yet never consumed. His heart quickened. "This is strange," he murmured. "I must go and see why the bush is not burned up." He stepped forward, and then a voice called to him from within the flames. "Moshe! Moshe!" Moshe froze, his breath caught in his throat. His name, spoken by a voice unlike any he had ever heard. It was deep, powerful, yet steady as the wind. It did not come from a man, nor from the earth. He swallowed hard and answered, "Here I am." Then the voice spoke again. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moshe's hands trembled as he bent down, slipping off his sandals, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath his feet. And the voice said, "I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Yitzchak, and the Elohim of Yaakov." At these words, Moshe hid his face. He fell to his knees, trembling. He could not look upon the presence of Elohim. And then Yahuah spoke again. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people in Mitzrayim. I have heard their cries because of their taskmasters, and I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey." Moshe closed his eyes, his heart pounding. For so long, he had tried to forget his past. But now, Yahuah was speaking of his people, and then the words that shook him to his core. "I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the children of Yisrael, out of Mitzrayim." Moshe's eyes widened. His breath came in short gasps. "Me?" he whispered. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Who am I that I should bring the children of Yisrael out of Mitzrayim?" He had once lived in Pharaoh's palace, but now he was only a shepherd. Yahuah answered, "I will surely be with you, and this will be the sign that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Mitzrayim, you will serve Elohim on this mountain." Moshe's mind swirled with doubt. What if they did not believe him? What if they asked who had sent him? He took a deep breath and asked, "When I come to the people of Israel and say, 'The Elohim of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" And Elohim answered, "Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am that I am. Tell them, Ehyeh has sent me to you." Moshe's hands gripped the earth beneath him. The name of Yahuah was powerful, holy, and unchanging. And Elohim continued, "Say to them, Yahuah, the Elohim of your fathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my remembrance from generation to generation." Moshe's heart ached. He had fled Mitzrayim. He had left that life behind. But now Yahuah was calling him back. "Yahuah," Moshe whispered, "what if they do not believe me? What if they will not listen to my voice?" And Yahuah said, "What is in your hand?" Moshe looked down. "A staff," he said. "Throw it to the ground." Moshe hesitated, then obeyed. The moment the staff touched the earth, it moved. Its wooden form twisted and coiled. A snake. Moshe gasped and leapt back. The serpent hissed, its body winding in the dust. Then Yahuah commanded, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." Moshe swallowed hard, his fingers trembling. Slowly, carefully, he reached forward and grasped the tail. In an instant, the serpent became a staff again in his hand. His heart raced, but Yahuah was not finished. "Put your hand inside your robe." Moshe did as he was told. "Now take it out." His breath caught in his throat. His hand was white as snow, covered in leprosy. His stomach twisted. Then Yahuah spoke again. "Put it back into your robe." He obeyed, and when he pulled it out again, it was restored. Moshe's eyes filled with awe. "If they do not believe the first sign," Yahuah said, "they will believe the second." Moshe bowed low. Yahuah had given him signs. He had given him his name. He had given him a command, and yet his voice trembled as he spoke. "But, Yahuah, I am slow of speech. I am not a man of words." And Yahuah answered, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf? or seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahuah? Now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say." Moshe's heart pounded, and so, with his staff in hand, he rose, for he had been called, and soon the deliverance of Yisrael would soon begin. Moshe stood before the burning bush, the heat of the flames warming his face, though the bush was never consumed. Yahuah had spoken to him. He had heard the voice of Elohim with his own ears. He had seen his staff turn into a serpent. He had watched his own hand become leprous, then be healed again. He had been given Yahuah's sacred name, the name above all names. And yet his heart was heavy with doubt. Moshe took a slow breath, his hands tightening into fists. "But Yahuah," he said softly, "I am not a man of words. Not yesterday, not before, not even now. My mouth is slow, and my tongue is heavy." He lowered his gaze to the ground. He could not go before Pharaoh. He was no speaker, no leader. The weight of such a task felt far too great for him. But Yahuah, full of patience and wisdom, answered, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahuah? Now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say." Moshe swallowed hard. His heart pounded. He should have trusted. He should have bowed and accepted his calling. But fear gripped him, and before he could stop himself, the words left his lips. "Please, Yahuah, send someone else." The flames of the bush flickered, and for the first time, Yahuah's anger burned against Moshe. Yet, in his mercy, he did not turn away from him. Instead, he said, "Is not Aharon, your brother, a Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the word in his mouth. I will be with your mouth and with his, and I will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and you shall be as Elohim to him. And take this staff in your hand, with which you shall do signs." Moshe closed his eyes. The choice was no longer his. Yahuah had called him, and now it was time to go. Moshe left the mountain, his feet moving quickly over the rocky path. He had spent years in the wilderness, herding sheep, watching the stars, living a simple life. Now that life was over. He returned to the tent where his wife, Zipporah, waited, their sons playing outside in the dust. She looked up at him, seeing the change in his face. "I must return to Mitzrayim," Moshe said, his voice steady, though his heart still wavered. Zipporah's eyes searched his. She did not ask why. She could see in his face that this was no ordinary journey. She gathered their things, their sons, and together they set out for Mitzrayim. On the way, as they traveled through the wilderness, something strange happened. The presence of Yahuah came upon them, heavy and fierce. Moshe, the chosen one, the man Yahuah had sent, was now facing judgment. For though he had obeyed the call, there was something left undone, something from the covenant of Abraham. Their son had not been circumcised, and Yahuah's command must be followed. Zipporah saw what was happening. She did not hesitate. She took a sharp stone, pressed it against her son's skin, and completed the covenant. Then she took the piece in her hand and touched Moshe's feet with it, saying, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." And the presence of Yahuah lifted. The journey could continue. Meanwhile, far away, Aharon was in Mitzrayim. The spirit of Yahuah stirred in his heart, and a voice whispered within him, "Go into the wilderness to meet your brother Moshe." Aharon's heart quickened. His brother. He hadn't seen him in so many years. He had thought Moshe was gone forever. And yet, Yahuah was sending him to meet him. He rose quickly and made his way into the wilderness. And there, on the road, he saw him. Moshe stood with his wife and children, his staff in hand, his eyes filled with something Aharon had never seen before. The two brothers embraced, their voices filled with wonder and joy. Then Moshe spoke. He told Aharon everything, about the burning bush, about Yahuah's name, about the signs, the staff that turned into a serpent, the hand that became leprous and was healed. And Aharon listened. He did not question, he did not doubt, for he knew that when Yahuah speaks, it must be obeyed. Together they continued toward Mitzrayim, toward the children of Yisrael, toward the mission that would change the world forever. When they arrived, they called together the elders of the people. Aharon stood before them and spoke the words that Moshe had received from Yahuah. Moshe lifted his staff, and before their eyes he performed the signs Yahuah had given him. The people watched, their eyes widened, and then their hearts bowed low. The cries that had risen for years, the prayers whispered in the dark, the longing for deliverance. Yahuah had heard them. Yahuah had seen them. Yahuah had come to save them. And so the people of Israel fell to their knees, their voices trembling, their hands covering their faces, and they worshipped, for their Elohim had not forgotten them. Moshe and Aharon stood at the gates of Pharaoh's great palace. The walls of Mitzrayim rose high above them, lined with statues of gods made by human hands. The air smelled of incense and stone, of riches and power. Servants rushed about, their heads bowed low, careful never to look Pharaoh in the eyes. Soldiers stood tall, gripping their spears, their faces unreadable. For years, the people of Israel had cried out under the weight of their suffering. Now, Moshe and Aharon had come to deliver a message, not from themselves, not from men, but from the one who had spoken from the burning bush. They stepped forward, their feet heavy yet steady. They were brought before Pharaoh, who sat upon his throne, surrounded by his magicians, advisors, and scribes. He wore a crown of gold, his robe gleaming in the torchlight. His eyes were sharp, piercing, watching them with curiosity and suspicion. And then Moshe and Aharon spoke. The Elohim of Yisrael says, "Let my people go, that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Silence filled the great hall. Pharaoh leaned forward, his lips curling. "The Elohim of Yisrael?" he repeated. His voice was amused. Mocking, his advisors chuckled under their breath. The gods of Mitzrayim were carved in stone, worshipped in grand temples, honored by the greatest nation on earth. Who was this Elohim that Moshe and Aharon spoke of? Pharaoh's voice hardened. Who is this Elohim that I should obey him and let Yisrael go? I do not know him, and I will not let Yisrael go. Moshe's throat tightened, but he did not waver. The Elohim of the Hebrews has met with us, he said. Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and offer sacrifices to him, or he may strike us with plague or with the sword. Pharaoh's expression darkened. His gaze swept over them, 2 old men, dressed in the robes of shepherds, standing before the most powerful ruler in the world, demanding the freedom of his laborers. His voice rose in anger. Why do you, Moshe and Aharon, take the people away from their work? Return to your burdens. He slammed his staff against the floor. These Hebrews are already too many in number, and now you want them to rest from their labor? No, they will work harder. The doors to the palace swung open. Moshe and Aharon were thrown out. And that very day, Pharaoh sent new orders to the taskmasters. The next morning, the men of Yisrael stood in the sun, waiting for their daily supply of straw. Straw was needed to make bricks. It held them together, made them strong. But when the taskmasters arrived, there was no straw to be found. One of the Hebrews stepped forward. "Where is the straw?" he asked cautiously. The taskmaster smirked. "No more straw will be given to you. You must gather it yourselves." A murmur of confusion spread through the workers. One man shook his head. "But if we must gather the straw, how will we meet our daily quota of bricks?" The taskmaster's smile faded. "Figure it out," he said coldly. "And if you fail, you will be beaten." The people scattered, rushing to the fields, searching for any scrap of straw they could find. They gathered dry stalks from the roadsides, pulling up weeds, collecting whatever they could. But it was never enough. The quotas remained the same, and when they failed, the whips cracked. Day after day, the elders of Yisrael went before Pharaoh, pleading for mercy. "We are doing all we can," they said, "but we have no straw. Why do you treat your servants this way? We are beaten, yet the fault is not ours." But Pharaoh only scoffed. "You are lazy," he said. "That is why you cry. Let us go and offer sacrifices. Now get back to work. No straw will be given to you, yet you must still make the same number of bricks." The elders left, their heads bowed, their hearts heavy with despair. They had hoped for freedom. Instead, things had become worse. As they walked back, they saw Moshe and Aharon waiting for them. Their eyes filled with anger, they rushed forward, their voices bitter. "May Elohim judge you," they said, their faces dark with sorrow. "You have made us a stench in Pharaoh's sight. You have placed a sword in his hand to kill us." Moshe stood still. He had known it would not be easy, but he had not expected this. Their eyes, once filled with hope, now held only despair. Their trust in him had faded, and in that moment, Moshe turned his face toward the heavens. His voice trembled. "Adonai," he whispered, "why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done nothing but bring more suffering upon them. And still, you have not delivered your people." Silence hung in the air. The cries of Yisrael echoed in the distance. Moshe stood alone, his heart heavy. The people of Israel had turned against him. Their suffering had increased. Their burdens had grown heavier, and they no longer believed that deliverance would come. And so Moshe lifted his eyes toward the heavens and cried out, "Adonai, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done nothing but bring more suffering upon them. And still, you have not delivered your people." The wind whispered through the wilderness. The weight of despair pressed down upon him. But then a voice, deep, steady, unshaken, spoke to Moshe. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." Moshe took a slow breath. He had not expected deliverance to be so difficult, but the voice continued, "I am Elohim. I appeared to Abraham, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov as El Shaddai, but by my name I did not make myself known to them. I established my covenant with them, to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as strangers. I have heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Mitzraites are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Now say to the children of Israel, I am Elohim, and I will bring you out from under the burden of the Mitzrites. I will rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your Elohim. You shall know that I am Elohim, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Mitzrites. And I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov, and I will give it to you as an inheritance. I am Elohim. Moshe's heart burned within him. These were not the words of a man. These were not the promises of earthly kings. This was the covenant of the Most High. He would not abandon his people. Moshe rose to his feet. He left the wilderness and returned to the people of Yisrael. He gathered the elders, the fathers, the men and women whose backs were bent under Pharaoh's cruelty, whose hands were cracked and bleeding from the labor of slavery. He looked into their eyes filled with exhaustion, with sorrow, with doubt, and he spoke the words Elohim had given him. He told them of the promise, of the deliverance that was coming, of the mighty hand that would set them free. But their hearts had grown weary, their spirits had been crushed, and they would not listen. The sound of their sighs filled the air, their shoulders sagging with defeat. Moshe felt the weight of it pressing upon him. How could he lead a people who had lost all hope? And then the voice of Elohim spoke to him again. Go in, speak to Pharaoh, king of Mitzrayim, and tell him to let the children of Yisrael go out of his land. Moshe closed his eyes. Adonai, he whispered, the people of Israel will not listen to me. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? For I am slow of speech. But Elohim did not relent. He had chosen Moshe for this task, and Pharaoh would not resist forever. Elohim spoke to Moshe and Aharon, commanding them concerning the children of Israel and concerning Pharaoh, king of Mitzrayim. They were to bring the people out of the land, no matter what stood in their way. The names of the sons of Israel, the tribes that had grown from Abraham's seed, were called forth: Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehudah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Binyamin, Yosef. And Moshe and Aharon were set apart, chosen by Elohim, to stand before Pharaoh and to lead these tribes, the 12 sons who had become a nation, out of slavery. They would go again to Pharaoh. They would speak the words they had been given. And though Pharaoh's heart was hardened, though his pride was great, the one who sent them was greater. Moshe stood at the entrance of the tent, his staff in hand. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the desert sands. The night before, he had spoken with Elohim, and now the time had come. It was time to stand before Pharaoh once more, time to deliver the warning, time for the first sign. He turned and saw Aharon waiting for him, his brother, his voice, the man Elohim had sent to stand beside him. Moshe gave a small nod. Aharon returned it, and together they set out for Pharaoh's palace. The halls of Pharaoh's throne room were as grand as before, tall, imposing, lined with statues of gods carved from stone. The air was filled with the scent of incense and oil, and golden light flickered from the torches that lined the walls. Pharaoh sat upon his throne, his robe gleaming in the morning light. He had not forgotten Moshe's words. The demand had been clear: let my people go. But Pharaoh had refused, and now Moshe and Aharon stood before him again. A silence settled over the room as Pharaoh leaned forward. His eyes were sharp, piercing. He studied them with a mixture of amusement and irritation. And then Moshe spoke. The Elohim of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me. But you have not listened. Now Elohim says this: by this you shall know that I am Elohim. Aharon stepped forward. He lifted his staff. Pharaoh watched, his expression unreadable. Then Aharon threw the staff to the ground. The wood struck the stone floor and moved. The staff twisted, lengthened, its wooden form shifting before their eyes. Gasps filled the room as it coiled, dark and glistening, its body winding over the floor. A serpent. The servants nearest to Pharaoh staggered back, eyes wide with fear. Pharaoh's gaze flickered to the creature, but then a smirk. He lifted a hand. At his command, his magicians stepped forward. Their robes rustled as they reached into their sleeves, pulling forth their own staffs. They whispered words, low and rhythmic, speaking in the name of their gods. Then, one by one, they threw down their staffs, and before the eyes of the court, theirs too became serpents. The magicians straightened, glancing at one another, smugness creeping into their expressions. Pharaoh leaned back into his throne, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. But then a heron serpent struck. It lunged, its dark body snapping forwards, sinking its fangs into the magician's serpents, and devoured them whole. The room fell silent. The magicians' faces paled. Their serpents, their symbols of power, had been swallowed up. The message was clear, but Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He waved a hand, dismissing Moshe and Aharon as though nothing had happened. And still, he refused to let the people go. The next morning, Moshe and Aharon stood beside the Yahuah, the great river of Mitzrayim. Pharaoh walked toward the water, his robes flowing behind him, his servants trailing at a respectful distance. It was his morning ritual. He stepped to the edge, where the waters stretched wide, shimmering in the early light. And there, standing on the banks, waiting for him, were Moshe and Aharon. Pharaoh's eyes darkened. Again they had come before him. Again they made their demands. He had not listened before, and he would not listen now. But Moshe spoke. This is what Elohim says. By this you shall know that I am Elohim. Behold, I will strike the waters of the river with the staff in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood. Pharaoh's mouth twisted into a scowl. Ridiculous. The river had been there since the days of his fathers, since the time of his ancestors. It was their life source, the gift of the gods. No one could touch the Yahuah, no one. But Moshe raised his hand. Aharon lifted his staff, and he struck the water. For a breath, nothing happened. Then a ripple spread across the surface. The water darkened. The blue waves shifted to red. Pharaoh's servants gasped, stepping backward, their sandals splashing against the banks. The fish rose, lifeless, to the surface. The scent of iron filled the air. The river, once pure, reeked of death. Pharaoh's eyes widened as the red stain spread. The people of Mitzrayim ran to their wells, their jars, their basins. But every vessel of water had turned to blood. Aharon lowered his staff. Moshe watched Pharaoh carefully. Would this be enough? Would he see the power of Elohim? Would he let the people go? But then, Pharaoh called for his magicians. They came forward, speaking in hushed tones, whispering to their gods. And through their secret arts, they took water from another vessel and made it appear as blood. Pharaoh smirked. He turned away, and he hardened his heart. For 7 days the waters of Mitzrayim remained blood. The people suffered. The land stank. Yet Pharaoh refused to listen. The waters of the Yahuah bore the stench of death. The Nile had run red with blood for 7 days. The fish had rotted in the sun. The wells had been emptied. The people of Mitzrayim had groaned in thirst, digging along the river banks, searching desperately for clean water. And yet, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He had not let the people go. And so Moshe and Aharon stood before him once more. The throne room was as grand as ever. Incense burned in golden braziers, servants knelt at Pharaoh's feet, and the magician stood silently at his side. Pharaoh's face was impassive, his eyes cold. He was waiting to see what Moshe would say next. The last time, it had been blood in the water, but this time, Moshe lifted his gaze. This is what Elohim says: "Let my people go, that they may serve me. If you refuse, I will plague your land with frogs." A hush fell over the room. Frogs? Pharaoh smirked. What kind of plague was that? Surely Moshe's Elohim had greater signs to show. Pharaoh lifted his hand, dismissing them. He had hardened his heart. So Moshe and Aharon turned and left the palace. And the moment they were gone, Aharon lifted his staff over the waters of Mitzrayim, and the frogs came forth. It started at the riverbanks. The water bubbled, rippling, shifting, and then the frogs emerged. One, then another, then thousands, tens of thousands. They poured onto the land, their green bodies slick with water, their limbs springing forward in great leaps. The first servants of Pharaoh laughed, stepping back as a few landed at their feet. But then they kept coming, more and more, until the fields turned green with movement. The frogs hopped into the streets, covering the paths, leaping through open doors. They climbed onto the beds of Pharaoh's people, into their ovens, into their bowls, into their very food. Women screamed. Men tried to sweep them away. But for every frog that was cast out, 100 more took its place. The once mighty kingdom of Mitzrayim belonged to the frogs. And then, at last, Pharaoh could endure it no longer. He sent for Moshe and Aharon. They returned to the palace, stepping through halls where frogs crouched in every shadow. Even the great Pharaoh sat stiffly upon his throne, a frog perched upon his armrest, croaking at his ear. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching in irritation. At last he spoke. "Pray to your Elohim to take away the frogs from me and my people. Then I will let the people go." Moshe studied him carefully. Pharaoh had hardened his heart before. Would he truly let them go now? Moshe nodded. "I will pray, and the frogs will leave. But know this, Pharaoh, there is none like our Elohim." Pharaoh said nothing. He simply waited. That evening, Moshe prayed. And by morning, the frogs were dead. Their lifeless bodies filled the streets, piled high in the corners of homes, heaped in the fields where grain once grew. The people of Mitzrayim worked tirelessly, gathering them into great mounds, and the land stank. Pharaoh stood at his window, watching as the people labored. He had cried out for relief, and relief had come. But now that the frogs were gone, now that the suffering had lifted, Pharaoh's heart hardened again, and he refused to let the people go. The third plague lies upon the land. Moshe and Aharon returned to Pharaoh. Again, they delivered the command, "Let my people go." Again, Pharaoh refused. So Elohim gave Moshe another command. This time, there would be no warning. Aharon struck the dust of the ground with his staff, and at once, the dust rose into the air. It spread over the land, carried by the wind, swirling into the villages and homes. And when it settled, it became lice. The tiny creatures crawled onto every man and beast. They bit at their skin, swarming over them, filling their hair, covering their bodies. The people of Mitzrayim cried out, scratching at their flesh, but there was no escape. Pharaoh called for his magicians. "Do the same," he commanded. The magicians whispered their spells, stretching out their hands over the dust. But this time, nothing happened. The magicians failed. They turned to Pharaoh, their faces pale, their voices hushed. "This is the finger of Elohim," they murmured. But Pharaoh would not listen, and his heart remained hard. The fourth plague, swarms of flies. The next morning, Moshe stood before Pharaoh. "This is what Elohim says. Let my people go that they may serve me. If you refuse, I will send swarms of flies upon you, upon your servants, upon your people, and into your houses. The houses of Mitzrayim shall be filled with them. But in the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, there shall be none." Pharaoh's expression darkened. Another plague. But this one would be different. The people of Mitzrayim would suffer, but the children of Yisrael would be spared. Moshe lifted his staff, and the flies came, thick black clouds of them. They poured into the homes, into the temples, into Pharaoh's palace itself. They buzzed in his ears, covered his arms, landed in his food. Pharaoh clenched his fists. He could not bear it. He called for Moshe and Aharon. "Go," he said quickly. "Go, sacrifice to your Elohim, but do it here, in the land." Moshe shook his head. "Our sacrifices are an abomination to the Mitzrites. If we offer them here, your people will stone us. We must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness." Pharaoh exhaled sharply. He thought for a long moment. Then, "Go, but do not go far." Moshe nodded, and as soon as he prayed, the flies were gone. Pharaoh looked around, taking in the silence, the stillness of the air. The plagues had lifted. The suffering had ended, and once again, his heart hardened, and he refused to let the people go. The great land of Mitzrayim was no longer the same. The Yahuah had turned to blood. The frogs had filled every house. The lice had swarmed over man and beast, and the flies had blackened the air. The people were weary. They had seen the power of Elohim, and yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The sun rose over the palace, casting long shadows on the golden walls. In the distance, the cries of the people could still be heard, and Moshe stood at the entrance once more. His staff was steady in his hand. His brother, Aharon, stood beside him. They had come again, for the command of Elohim had not changed. Moshe stepped forward and spoke. "This is what Elohim, the Elohim of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go that they may serve me. For if you continue to refuse, behold, the hand of Elohim will be upon your livestock in the field, upon the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. There will be a severe plague. But in the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, not a single animal shall be harmed, that you may know that I am Elohim." Pharaoh's face remained unreadable. The magicians at his side shifted uncomfortably, but none dared to speak. He had heard these warnings before, and he had not listened. The fifth plague, pestilence, strikes the livestock. The next morning, as the people of Mitzrayim went to tend their herds, a strange stillness lay upon the land. A shepherd walked into the field and called to his oxen, but they did not move. Another man approached his stables, reaching for his horse's reins. The horse collapsed beneath him. Everywhere across Mitzrayim, the livestock fell. The mighty camels, the strong oxen, the sheep, and the goats, all struck by the plague. The people wailed in sorrow, their hands gripping the lifeless bodies of their beasts. But in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel lived, their flocks stood strong. Their herds were untouched. Not a single sheep had perished. The message was clear. This was no accident. This was the hand of Elohim. Messengers ran to the palace, their feet pounding against the stone. They fell before Pharaoh, breathless, their voices urgent. The livestock of Mitzrayim has been struck down, but in Goshen none have died. Pharaoh's jaw tightened. He said nothing. He did not command his people to mourn the loss. He did not tell his soldiers to seek relief. Instead, he hardened his heart, and he would not let the people go. The sixth plague boils upon the skin. The next morning, as the sun climbed higher, Moshe and Aharon stood before Pharaoh again. No warning was given this time. Elohim spoke to Moshe, "Take handfuls of ashes from the furnace, and let Moshe scatter them toward the sky in the sight of Pharaoh." Moshe bent down. He reached into a furnace, his fingers brushing against the fine, black ashes. He stood tall, lifting his hands, the ashes clinging to his palms, and then he scattered them into the sky. The wind caught them, carrying them over the land, and wherever the ashes fell, boils broke out upon the skin, painful, burning. The people cried out as the sores covered their bodies, their flesh inflamed, their skin raw. The magicians, those who had once mocked Moshe, those who had turned staffs into serpents and water into blood, now cowered in agony. Their own skin was covered in sores. They could not even stand before Moshe, for the power of Elohim was too great. Pharaoh saw it all. He watched as his own people suffered, as his own magicians fell, as his own skin burned with the plague. Yet still he did not listen. His heart was like stone, and he would not let the people go. The seventh plague, hail and fire from the heavens. Once more Moshe returned. He raised his voice before Pharaoh. "This is what Elohim says. Let my people go that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues upon your heart, upon your servants, and upon your people, that you may know there is none like me in all the earth. By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you from the earth. But I have allowed you to stand, so that my name may be declared in all the earth. If you still exalt yourself and refuse to let my people go, tomorrow I will send a hailstorm unlike any that has ever been seen in Mitzrayim, from the day it was founded until now. Now, send word to your people. Bring your servants, your livestock, and all that you have into shelter, for whatever is left in the field shall die when the hail falls upon it." The servants listened. Some of them, fearing the word of Elohim, ran to gather their animals and bring them to safety. But others laughed, mocked, ignored the warning. The next morning Moshe lifted his staff to the sky. The heavens darkened, the clouds swirled, and then the hail came down. It pounded the fields, striking the earth with fury. It crushed the grain, shattered the trees, smashed the stone streets, and with the hail came fire. Blazing flames rained down with the ice, tearing through the land. There was no storm like it in the history of Mitzrayim. But in Goshen, where the children of Yisrael lived, not a single stone of hail fell. Pharaoh staggered. The sound of the storm roared in his ears, the flames reflecting in his eyes. And at last, he cried out, "I have sinned this time." Pharaoh called, "Elohim is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. Pray to your Elohim. Let there be no more thunder and hail. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer." Moshe looked upon him. He had seen Pharaoh's heart waver before. He had heard his promises, only to see them broken. But he answered, "As soon as I leave the city, I will spread out my hands to Elohim, and the thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth belongs to him." But as for you and your servants, I know that you do not yet fear Elohim." And so Moshe stepped out into the storm. He spread his hands to the sky. The thunder ceased. The hail stopped. The fire was gone. And Pharaoh hardened his heart once more. He did not let the people go. The night was still as the people of Yisrael left Mitzrayim behind. For 430 years, they had been slaves. They had labored under harsh taskmasters, their cries rising to the heavens. But tonight, they walked as free people. The streets of Mitzrayim were silent. The homes of the Mitzrites were dark, filled with mourning. The final plague had struck. Every firstborn in the land had perished. Pharaoh had finally relented. "Go," he had commanded Moshe. "Take your people and leave. Serve your Elohim as you have said." And so they went. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children moved as one, their belongings strapped to their backs. Fathers led their families, their staffs in hand, their faces turned toward the wilderness. Mothers carried their young ones, holding them close, whispering words of comfort. The flocks and herds moved among them, their hooves stirring the dust beneath the moonlit sky. And ahead of them, a cloud rose high above the people, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, Yahuah himself leading them. They did not know where the path would take them, but they followed, they trusted, for the Most High was with them. Days passed as the people journeyed toward the wilderness. But back in Mitzrayim, a Pharaoh sat upon his throne. His grief had turned to fury. His land was in ruins. His people were broken. His own son was gone. And now the slaves had escaped. Pharaoh's eyes burned with anger. "What have we done?" he roared to his servants. "Why have we let Yisrael go from serving us?" His fists clenched. His pride would not allow it. "Prepare my chariot," he ordered. "Gather my armies. We will pursue them and bring them back." And so Pharaoh's army set out. Chariots rumbled over the earth, 600 of his finest leading the way. The soldiers' armor gleamed in the sun, their swords sharp, their horses swift. They rode with one purpose: to overtake Yisrael, to bring them back in chains, to crush their hope before it could take root. The people of Israel stood upon the shore of the Red Sea. Before them, the waters stretched wide, deep, vast, uncrossable. Behind them, the dust of Pharaoh's army rose into the sky. The sound of chariots thundered in the distance. The people turned and saw them coming, their hearts filled with fear. "Moshe!" they cried. "Why have you brought us out here to die? Were there not enough graves in Mitzrayim? It would have been better for us to serve the Mitzrite than to perish in the wilderness." Moshe stood before them, his face calm. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Stand still and see the salvation of Yahuah. The Mitzrites you see today, you will never see again. Yahuah will fight for you. You need only be still." The wind stirred. The cloud of Yahuah moved, shifting from before them to behind them, blocking Pharaoh's army. The Mitzrites were engulfed in darkness, unable to move forward. But Israel stood in the light. Then Elohim spoke to Moshe. "Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, that the children of Israel may go through on dry ground." Moshe lifted his staff, and the winds began to blow. The wind howled. It rushed over the waters, pushing them back. The sea rose up, standing like two towering walls, stretching high into the sky. Between them, a path of dry ground. The people gasped. It was a miracle. Moshe turned to them. "Go," he commanded. and the people of Yisrael stepped forward. Step by step, they walked between the waters, their feet dry upon the seabed. Children clung to their mothers. Fathers held their sons' hands. The entire nation moved forward, crossing the sea. Behind them, the clouds still held back Pharaoh's army. But as the last of Israel stepped onto the far shore, the cloud lifted. Pharaoh saw the path before him, and he gave the order, "Go after them!" The Mitzrites charged forward. The sound of chariots echoed between the walls of water. The horses pounded the earth. The soldiers shouted, urging them faster. The Mitzrites rode into the sea. But something was wrong. Their wheels spun, struggling in the mud. The chariots swerved, crashing into one another. Fear spread through the ranks. "Let us flee," the soldiers shouted. "Yahuah fights for Yisrael." But it was too late. Moshe turned back toward the waters. He raised his staff once more, and Elohim said, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may return upon Pharaoh and his army." Moshe stretched out his hand, and the walls of water collapsed. The sea rushed back into place, crashing down with mighty force. The chariots were swallowed. The horses disappeared beneath the waves. The mighty warriors of Mitzrayim were no more. Not one remained. The people of Israel stood upon the shore, watching the sea grow still once more. The enemy that had pursued them was gone. A great silence fell over them. Then a single voice rose in praise. Then another and another, and soon the people sang aloud, their voices lifting to the heavens. Miriam, the sister of Moshe, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her, dancing and rejoicing. "Sing to Yahuah," they cried, "for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." The Most High had delivered them, and they would never be slaves again. Israel had crossed over into freedom, and their journey to the Promised Land had only just begun. The wilderness stretched wide before them, a vast and endless land. The people of Israel had walked for weeks since crossing the sea, their feet pressing into the hot sand, their journey led only by the cloud by day and the fire by night. They had seen wonders, water brought from a rock, bread from the heavens, victory against their enemies. Yet they had not yet known what it meant to be truly set apart. Then, at last, they came to the foot of a great mountain. Its peak rose high into the sky, its rugged cliffs standing unmoved through time. This was Mount Sinai, the place where the Most High had called Moshe to bring his people. Here, in this sacred place, they would receive his covenant, his commands, his instructions for life. The people set up camp, their tents forming a great assembly at the base of the mountain. Fathers gathered their children, pointing toward the towering peak. Mothers whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with wonder. They all knew something was about to happen. Moshe stood before them and spoke the words given to him by Elohim. "You have seen what I did to the Mitzrites, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will indeed obey my voice and guard my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all nations. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a set-apart nation." The people listened, their hearts stirred within them, and with one voice they answered, "All that Elohim has spoken, we will do." Moshe climbed the mountain, his feet pressing into the rough stone, his breath slow and steady as he ascended into the presence of the Most High. Elohim spoke again, commanding the people to prepare themselves. "Go to the people and set them apart today and tomorrow. Let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day I will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. The message spread through the camp. The people bathed, cleansed their garments, and purified themselves. A hush fell over the assembly. Fathers whispered to their children, telling them to stay back, for no one was to touch the mountain upon which Elohim would descend. Mothers pressed their hands over their hearts, their eyes lifted toward the sky. And then the third day arrived. The morning light broke over the horizon, but the sky soon darkened. A thick cloud descended upon the mountain, rolling over the cliffs like smoke from a great fire. Thunder shook the air, echoing through the valley. The earth trembled beneath their feet. Then the blast of a shofar rang out, piercing and strong. It grew louder and louder until the very heavens seemed to vibrate with its sound. The people trembled. Moshe led them forward to the base of the mountain, and the presence of Elohim covered the peak in fire. The smoke rose high, flames licking the heavens, the whole mountain quaking under his power. And then, from within the fire, from within the cloud, from within the trembling earth, the voice of Elohim spoke. I am Yahuah, your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Mitzrayim, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other mighty ones before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, nor any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or in the earth beneath, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, Yahuah, your Elohim, am a jealous Elohim, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands of those who love me and guard my commands. You shall not take the name of Yahuah, your Elohim, in vain, for Yahuah does not leave unpunished the one who brings his name to ruin. Remember the Sabbath day, to set it apart. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of Yahuah your Elohim. You shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your servant, nor your livestock, nor the stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahuah made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, Yahuah blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long upon the land which Yahuah your Elohim is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that belongs to your neighbor. The people stood in awe. Their hearts trembled within them, for they had heard the voice of Elohim. The mountains still smoked, the earth still shook beneath their feet. They drew back, afraid. Moshe, you speak to us and we will listen, they pleaded. But let not Elohim speak to us again, lest we die. Moshe reassured them. Do not be afraid. Elohim has come to test you, that his fear may be before you, so that you do not sin. But the people stood at a distance, while Moshe stepped forward into the darkness where Elohim was. Elohim gave Moshe more laws, instructions on how to live as a holy people, commands of justice and righteousness, laws of mercy and kindness. And then Elohim said, Behold, I am sending my messenger before you, to guard you on the way, and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Listen to his voice, and do not rebel against him, for he does not bear with transgression, for my name is in him. When Moshe returned to the people, he told them all the words of Yahuah, and they answered again, All that Yahuah has spoken, we will do. So Moshe wrote down the words of the covenant, and early the next morning he built an altar at the foot of the mountain. he took the book of the covenant and read it aloud to the people. And again, they said, "All that Yahuah has spoken, we will do, and we will obey." Then Moshe went up the mountain again, and there, in the presence of the Most High, Elohim gave him 2 tablets of stone inscribed by his own hand. The covenant was sealed. The law was given. The people of Israel belonged to Elohim. But even as Moshe remained in the presence of Yahuah, down below something was stirring, for the hearts of the people were not yet fully turned toward him. The mountain still stood, wrapped in cloud and fire, trembling beneath the weight of Elohim's presence. Moshe had gone up into the heights, stepping into the darkness where Elohim was. There he remained for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving the Torah, the laws and instructions that would set Yisrael apart as his people. But down below in the valley, the hearts of the people began to waver. They had seen the power of the Most High. They had heard his voice thunder from the mountain. Yet, as the days stretched on and Moshe did not return, doubt crept in like a shadow. They gathered around Aharon, their voices filled with fear and impatience. "Make us a mighty one to go before us," they said. "As for Moshe, the man who brought us out of Mitzrayim, we do not know what has become of him." Aharon looked up on the people, their eyes bleeding, their hearts restless, and instead of standing firm, he listened to their request. "Take the gold from your earrings, from your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring it to me." The people hurried to their tents, pulling off their golden ornaments, gifts they had received from the Mitzrites on the night of their deliverance. They piled them before Aharon, and he took the gold and melted it down. He shaped it with a tool, crafting it into the form of a calf. And when the people saw it, they rejoiced. "This is your mighty one, O Yisrael, who brought you out of the lands of Mitzrayim," they cried. Aharon built an altar before it and declared, "Tomorrow is a feast to Yahuah." And the next day they rose early. They brought offerings. They ate and drank, and they rose up to play, their hearts drawn away, their minds no longer set upon the one who had delivered them. High upon the mountain, Moshe stood in the presence of Elohim. The tablets of the covenant lay before him, inscribed by the very finger of Elohim. He listened as the commands and instructions were spoken, as the ways of righteousness were revealed. But then the voice of Elohim grew heavy with anger. "Go down at once," he commanded, "for your people, whom you brought out of Mitzrayim, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly from the way I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf, and they have bowed down to it, and they have sacrificed to it, saying, 'This is your mighty one, O Yisrael, who brought you out of Mitzrayim.'" Moshe's heart bounded. "Now let me alone, that my wrath may burn against them, and that I may consume them, but I will make of you a great nation." Moshe fell before the Most High. "O Yahuah, why does your wrath burn against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Mitzrayim with great power and a strong hand? Why should the Mitzrites say, 'He brought them out to destroy them in the mountains, to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath. Remember Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to whom you swore by yourself, saying, 'I will make your seed as numerous as the stars of the heavens, and I will give them this land as an everlasting inheritance.'" Moshe pleaded, and Elohim relented. Moshe turned, gathering the stone tablets, his face dark with grief. He descended the mountain, stepping down toward the valley where the people had gathered. And as he drew near, he saw it, the golden calf, the people dancing before it, their voices lifted in false worship. His heart burned with anger, and with all his strength he cast down the tablets, shattering them at the base of the mountain. The people turned in shock. The sound of the stone breaking echoed through the valley. Moshe rushed forward. He seized the golden calf, threw it into the fire, and ground it into dust. Then he scattered the ashes over the water and commanded the people to drink it. Then he turned to Aharon. "What did these people do to you, that you brought this great sin upon them?" Aharon looked away, his voice faltering. "Do not be angry, my master," he said. "You know the people, that they are set on evil. They said to me, 'Make us a mighty one to go before us.' So I told them to bring me their gold. I cast it into the fire, and out came this calf." Moshe's face remained hard. He saw the people were unrestrained, their hearts no longer fearing the Most High. Then he stood at the entrance of the camp and called out, "Whoever is for Yahuah, come to me." And the sons of Levi gathered to him. "Thus says Yahuah, each man put his sword on his side, and go through the camp from gate to gate, and slay those who persist in rebellion." And that day 3,000 men fell. The camp grew silent. The weight of their sin pressed upon them. Moshe turned again to Elohim, his heart heavy. "You have committed a great sin," he told the people. "But now I will go up to Yahuah. Perhaps I may make atonement for you." Once more he climbed the mountain, his steps slower than before, his spirit burdened, and when he reached the presence of Elohim, he fell to his knees. "O Yahuah, this people has committed a great sin. They have made for themselves a mighty one of gold. Yet now, if you would forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written." Elohim answered, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But go now, lead the people to the place of which I have spoken to you. My messenger shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day of my visitation, I will visit their sin upon them." And Elohim sent a plague among the people because of what they had done with the golden calf. The covenant had been broken, but Moshe did not give up. He pleaded again before Elohim, standing as an intercessor for Israel, and Elohim, in his mercy, renewed the covenant. Once more, Moshe ascended the mountain, and once more Elohim gave him 2 new tablets of stone. But this time, when Moshe came down, his face shone with light. The people looked upon him in awe, for the presence of Elohim was upon him. The covenant was restored. The journey continued. The camp of Yisrael stretched across the wilderness, a gathering of families, flocks, and tents, all centered around one thing: the mountain where Elohim had spoken. They had seen his fire descend upon Sinai, had heard his voice thunder from the heavens, and had received his covenant written in stone. But Elohim was not only the Elohim of the mountain, he was the Elohim of his people, and now he was going to dwell among them. Moshe stood before the assembly and spoke the words given to him. "Elohim has commanded us to build for him a dwelling place, that his presence may be among us. Every heart that is willing, bring an offering to Yahuah: gold and silver, fine linen and blue thread, acacia wood, and precious stones." The people listened, their hearts, once filled with fear, now burned with devotion. They hurried to their tents, gathering all that they had. Some brought gold earrings and silver bracelets, others fine woven fabrics, still others the strong wood needed for building. They came forward willingly, joyfully, laying their gifts before Moshe. Men skilled in craftsmanship stepped forward. Bezalel and Aholiab were filled with the spirit of Elohim. given wisdom and understanding to craft everything according to the pattern Elohim had shown Moshe. And so the work began. The people wove fine linen embroidered with blue, purple, and scarlet thread. They hammered gold into thin plates, fastening them into loops and rings. The acacia wood was cut, shaped, and covered in gold. The men labored with skill, their hands moving with purpose, their hearts stirred with the knowledge that they were building something holy. Bit by bit, the pieces came together. They built the curtains of the tabernacle, stretching high around the sacred place. They crafted the Ark of the Covenant, its pure gold covering shining in the light. The wings of the cherubim outstretched over it. They made the table of showbread, where the bread of presence would always be before Elohim. They fashioned a lampstand of gold, its branches carved with almond blossoms, its 7 lamps waiting to shine. They built the altar of incense, where sweet-smelling smoke would rise in worship. They set up the bronze altar, where offerings would be made, and the bronze laver filled with water for cleansing. Every part of it was made exactly as Elohim had commanded. And when the work was finished, Moshe stood back and looked upon it all. It was complete. The dwelling place of Elohim was ready. Then Elohim spoke again. "Take Aaron and his sons, and set them apart to serve as priests before me. Make for them set-apart garments of glory and beauty, a breastplate of precious stones, an ephod of gold and fine linen, a robe of blue with bells and pomegranates around its hem, a turban with a gold plate that bore the words, 'Set apart to Yahuah.'" Aaron and his sons stood before the people. Moshe anointed them with oil, consecrating them for service. From that day on, they would minister before Elohim in the tabernacle. At last, it was time. The tabernacle stood in the center of the camp, its golden furnishings shining, its embroidered curtains swaying in the desert wind. The people gathered as Moshe took the tablets of the covenant and placed them inside the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was carried into the most set-apart place, behind the great veil, and then a cloud descended, thick, glorious, radiant with the presence of Elohim. It filled the tabernacle, covering it in awe and wonder. The people fell to their knees. Moshe himself could not enter, for the glory of Yahuah filled the dwelling place. And from that day forward, whenever the cloud remained over the tabernacle, Yisrael stayed where they were. But when the cloud lifted, they knew it was time to move. As they set out, the cloud of Yahuah rose from the tabernacle, moving before them, leading the way. When it moved, they followed. When it remained, they stayed. They traveled not by their own plans, but by the will of the Most High. But the wilderness was vast, and the hearts of the people were still being tested. The sun beat down upon the desert sand, the days stretched long, the nights grew cold, and the journey was not easy. The people began to grumble. "If only we had meat to eat," they cried. "We remember the fish we ate in Mitzrayim, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing but this manna before us." The manna, the bread from the heavens, was like fine flakes, white as coriander seed, tasting like wafers made with honey. It was enough. It had always been enough. But the people longed for more. Moshe heard their complaints. His spirit grew heavy, and he turned to Yahuah. "Why have you dealt so harshly with me?" he pleaded. "Did I conceive these people? Did I bring them forth that you should say to me, 'Carry them in your arms as a nurse carries a baby'? Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? I cannot bear this burden alone." Yahuah answered him, "Gather 70 men from the elders of Israel, men you know to be leaders. and bring them before the tent of meeting. I will take some of the Spirit that is upon you and place it upon them, that they may bear the burden with you. And so it was done. The elders stood before the tabernacle, and the Spirit of Elohim rested upon them, giving them wisdom to lead. But to the people, Yahuah said, You have wept for meat, you shall eat, not for 1 day, nor 2 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. Because you have rejected Yahuah, who is among you, and you have wept before him, saying, Why did we leave Mitzrayim? Then a wind arose. It swept over the camp, bringing quail from the sea, covering the ground 3 feet deep. The people rushed out, gathering the birds by the thousands. They ate, but their greed brought judgment upon them. A plague struck many, and the place was called Kibroth Hatava, the graves of craving. For the people had desired the food of their past more than the provision of their Elohim. The journey continued, but soon another test arose. Miriam and Aharon, Moshe's own brother and sister, spoke against him. Has Yahuah only spoken through Moshe? Has he not also spoken through us? But Yahuah heard, and suddenly the cloud descended upon the tabernacle. The voice of Elohim called out, Come forward, Moshe, Aharon, and Miriam. Trembling, they stepped before him. And Yahuah said, Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I make myself known to him in visions. I speak to him in dreams, but not so with my servant Moshe. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant? The cloud lifted, and as Miriam turned, her skin was white with leprosy. Aharon cried out, O my master, do not let this sin remain upon us. Moshe lifted his voice and pleaded before Elohim. Heal her now, O Elohim, I pray. And Yahuah, in his mercy, healed Miriam, though she remained outside the camp for 7 days as a sign. The people waited, then they journeyed on. The wilderness was harsh, the journey was long, but the greatest test of all was still ahead. They were approaching the land of promise, and soon the moment of decision would come. The journey through the wilderness had been long, but now the land of promise was near. The people of Israel had walked through the desert, following the cloud by day and the fire by night. They had received the Torah, seen the tabernacle filled with the presence of Elohim, and had been sustained by manna from heaven. And now they stood at the border of the land that had been promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Moshe called the people together, and before them stood 12 chosen men, one from each tribe. These were not ordinary men. They were leaders, respected and trusted by their people. Among them were Caleb of the tribe of Yehudah and Yahusha of the tribe of Ephraim. Moshe turned to the 12 and spoke, Go up into the land of Canaan and see what it is like. Are the people strong or weak? Are they few or many? Is the land good or bad? Are the cities fortified or open? Is the land rich or poor? Bring back some of its fruit, so we may know what awaits us. The 12 spies nodded and set out, crossing over into the land that Elohim had promised. For 40 days the men walked through the land. They saw rolling hills, lush valleys, and rivers flowing with life. The land was good, rich with abundance, just as Elohim had said. But they also saw mighty cities with high walls. They saw strong warriors who seemed like giants. In a valley called Eshcol, they came upon a vineyard unlike any they had ever seen. The fruit was so abundant that one single cluster of grapes was so large it had to be carried by 2 men on a pole. Taking the fruit with them, They turned back toward the camp. They had seen the land. Now they would give their report. As they approached, the people rushed out to meet them. "What did you see?" they asked. "Is the land truly as wonderful as Elohim promised?" The spies lifted the fruit high for all to see. "The land is good," they declared. "It flows with milk and honey." The people cheered. But then 10 of the spies shook their heads. They said, "The land is good, but the people are strong." They said, "The cities are large and fortified. We saw giants, the descendants of Anak. We are like grasshoppers in their sight. We cannot take the land." Fear spread through the camp like wildfire. The people began to murmur, "Why has Elohim brought us here, only to be destroyed? It would have been better for us to stay in Mitzrayim. Let us choose another leader and return." But one voice rose above the rest. Caleb stepped forward. His eyes burned with faith, and his voice was steady. "Let us go up at once and take the land. We are well able to overcome it." But the 10 spies shook their heads. "No, we are not able. They are stronger than we are." The people wept that night, their cries filling the air. They refused to trust Elohim. At sunrise, Moshe and Aaron fell on their faces before the congregation, pleading with them. Then Yahushua, son of Nun, stepped forward, standing beside Caleb. "The land we passed through is exceedingly good," he cried. "If Yahuah delights in us, he will bring us into it. Do not rebel against Yahuah, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are like bread for us. Their protection has left them, and Yahuah is with us. Do not be afraid." But the people refused to listen. They picked up stones, ready to strike Yahushua and Caleb down. And then the cloud of Yahuah descended upon the tabernacle. A deep silence fell over the camp, and Elohim spoke. "How long will these people reject me? How long will they refuse to trust in me? Despite all the signs I have done among them, I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. And I will make of you, Moshe, a greater and mightier nation." Moshe fell on his face before Yahuah, pleading for mercy. "O Yahuah, do not destroy this people. If you do, the nations will say, 'He brought them out of Mitzrayim only to destroy them in the wilderness.' Show your great mercy as you have before." Yahuah heard Moshe's plea. "I have forgiven them," he said, "but as surely as I live, not one of them who has seen my wonders and yet rejected me shall enter the land. Only my servant Caleb, who has a different spirit and follows me completely, shall inherit it, and Yahushua, son of Nun, shall lead Yisrael in." Then Elohim pronounced their punishment. "Your children shall wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies search the land. Until this generation is gone, you shall not enter the promise." The 10 spies who had spread fear among the people were struck with a plague and perished. The camp grew silent. Their hearts were heavy. They had come so close, but because of their unbelief, they would now wander the wilderness for 40 years. Yet even in judgment, there was hope, for a new generation would rise. Through the years, the people had been tested again and again. They had fought against kings and giants, marching forward at the command of Elohim. They had seen Balak, the king of Moab, try to curse them through the prophet Bilam, only for Elohim to turn the curse into a blessing. They had faced rebellion, plagues, and trials, yet through it all, Elohim had remained faithful. Now, standing before the people for the last time, Moshe's voice was strong. "Hear, O Yisrael, today I set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life that you and your children may live. Love Yahuah your Elohim, walk in his ways, and guard his commands. For he is your life and the length of your days, and he will give you the land he swore to your fathers. The people listened, their eyes upon him, their hearts open. Moshe continued, reminding them of all that Elohim had done. Do not forget, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build houses and dwell in them, when your herds and flocks increase, do not say, my own strength has gained me this wealth. Remember Yahuah, your Elohim, for it is he who gives you the power to prosper. The words etched into their souls. He warned them, too, of what would happen if they turned away. If you follow after other mighty ones, if you walk in the ways of the nations around you, you will perish from the land. But if you return to Yahuah with all your heart and soul, he will gather you back, no matter how far you have been scattered. Then Moshe lifted his hands and blessed the people, each tribe by name, speaking words of promise over them. Yehudah, the tribe of strength and kingship. Levi, the tribe of priests and teachers. Yosef, the fruitful bough, blessed beyond measure. One by one, he spoke over them, giving them their inheritance, their place among Israel. Then, at last, his task was complete. Moshe turned and walked alone toward the mountain. He climbed to the peak of Mount Nebo, where Elohim had led him, and from there Elohim showed him all the land, the valleys, the rivers, the hills stretching far and wide, the land of Yehudah, the land of Naphtali, the land of Yosef, the land promised to their fathers. Moshe's heart was full, the journey was complete, and there, in the presence of Elohim, Moshe, the servant of Yahuah, breathed his last. The people of Israel mourned him for 30 days, their hearts heavy, their eyes filled with tears, but his spirit remained with them. And Yahuah had already chosen their new leader, Yahusha, son of Nun, the one who had spied out the land and remained faithful. The one who had walked beside Moshe as his servant was now the leader of Israel. And Yahuah spoke to him, saying, Be strong and courageous, do not be afraid, nor be discouraged, for Yahuah your Elohim is with you wherever you go. The time had come, the wandering was over, and under Yahusha's leadership, Yisrael would finally cross the Jordan. As we finish Shemot, we must remember Yahuah and all he did for his people. This was still just the beginning. We will read and learn so much more as we continue on to Yahusha. Until next time, little one, Lila Tov and Shalom.